This video is meant to be a relatively concise guide to Old English pronunciation. If you're new to the channel, by the way, welcome. I have recently written a book, here it is, Oswald Bera, An Introduction to Old English, which does what it says on the tin. It introduces you to the Old English language in the form of a hopefully fun story about an adventurous bear and his exploits in England around the year 1000. You can pick it up today. Link is in the description. But let's get to our topic, the pronunciation of Old English. Let me briefly convince you that this is worth learning. After all, Old English is a historical language, so although there are people who speak it today, most of what you're going to be doing in this language is reading. Now, if you're reading poetry, it's especially important to know what the words sounded like, because the pronunciation of words is an extremely important part of what makes poetry poetry. In Old English, the rules of poetry dictate what kinds of words can appear where, and this depends on things like whether vowels are long or short, how many syllables are in words, and most importantly, and most famously for Old English poetry, what sound is at the start of words. This is the principle of alliteration, and this is one of the most important things in Old English poetry, to the point where the form of poetry used in Old English is typically just called alliterative verse. Unless you understand all of these things, at least to some degree, you're not going to get Old English poetry to its fullest. But even if you're reading a prose text, one that doesn't use sound-based principles of organization, and believe me, actually some prose texts in Old English do, it's still important for you to learn how to pronounce Old English. For one thing, you may want to read out loud. Personally, when I'm learning a language, reading out loud is one of the most helpful things that I do. It seems to integrate the knowledge that I'm gaining from my reading so much better than just reading silently does. And if you want to read out loud, you're going to need at least a basic understanding of how the language is pronounced. But even if you don't want to read out loud, it's still important to learn the pronunciation of the language. This is because when we read, we do something called subvocalize. In essence, we read aloud to ourselves in our heads. This process of subvocalization is extremely important in memory formation, and when you are learning a language by reading, you're going to want every little bit of help you can get to memory formation. So, pronunciation, very important. Hope I've convinced you. So if I've convinced you now that learning to pronounce Old English is worth doing, I want to convince you that you should believe me that we have a pretty good idea of how Old English was pronounced, despite the fact that they didn't have tape recorders back in Anglo-Saxon times. The reason that we have a good idea of the pronunciation of Old English is due to the art and science of linguistic reconstruction. Now, how this works is worth a whole video of its own, but I'll give you some general principles here so you can see what kind of evidence goes into the process of historical reconstruction. Essentially, linguists use multiple kinds of evidence to arrive at a hypothesis of what the language sounded like, and this hypothesis is called a reconstruction. So what kinds of evidence are these? Well, there are 7 main types that I could think of at least, but not all of them are equally available, useful, or trustworthy, which means that we have to, in any given case of reconstruction, we have to consider multiple sources of evidence, and when they all point in the same direction, this is something that gives us confidence in the reconstruction. The 7 types of evidence are, in no particular order. Number 1, grammatical reconstructions. This is when someone at the time writes a text saying, oh, this sound is pronounced like so. The sound written Y is pronounced like an E, but with a rounding of the lips, Ü. This isn't something that we have for Old English, but we have something in very early Middle English, so right after the Old English period, a text that is kind of an indirect linguistic description, and this text is called the Ormulum. And what's really fun about this text is that the author was very concerned with people pronouncing English as he saw it correctly, so he took care to write down long and short vowels differently. And so this is a really great source of evidence for the difference between long and short vowels in Old English, even though it's a little bit after the Old English period. You know these periods aren't hard and fast things anyway. But we really don't have much in the way of the grammatical description for Old English. So we can move on to the second type of evidence, which is written documents. And these we have lots of, but they require interpretation. For example, Old English is typically written in the Latin alphabet. This is our familiar alphabet that we use for modern English, A, B, C, and so forth, although the Old English version has a few different letters, and we'll talk about those in a bit. but it's not entirely obvious what the sounds represent just because something's written with a C sound. What does that tell us? We know that in modern languages, the C letter can write a variety of different sounds, k, ch, s, ts, and so forth. So we may be in that kind of situation with Old English. The application of the Latin alphabet to the language might not be straightforward. And indeed, it isn't entirely straightforward. But we can still glean some things from the fact that a scribe used the Latin letter P to describe a particular sound. It's probably not entirely unrelated to the sound in Latin represented by that P letter. So something like P. Probably not something like ng or U or something like that. It's probably these letters were probably chosen for a reason. Another source of evidence is poetic practices. So we talked about poetry a little bit above, and we said that Old English verse is alliterative in nature, which means that it depends on matching the sounds at the starts of words, more or less. There are some caveats to that, but it depends on matching sounds at the starts of words in the poetic lines. So this means that the speakers, when they alliterate two sounds together, that means that they conceive of those two sounds as, in some sense, similar or the same. So this tells us something. Although here we have to be careful too, because we know that poetic traditions are often somewhat conservative, and they can reflect things that are no longer true in the speech of the poets. For example, poets often rhyme words like blood and food. So those don't rhyme in modern English. They look like they should, but they don't rhyme in modern English. They did in earlier forms of English. But poets were still rhyming these words together even after it's clear that they were no longer rhyming in speech. So this practice, which is often called eye rhyme because the things look to the eye as if they rhyme, but they don't sound like it. This can cause problems when we're assuming that the way that poets practice their poetry represents their speech. Sometimes it doesn't, but at least it's another source of evidence. Number 4, we can look at later forms. Modern English, like many other languages, has many different varieties, and these varieties have different characteristics. For example, the word spelled C-A-R is pronounced with a consonant at the end in some dialects, such as my own, car, and in others it's pronounced with a vowel at the end, as if it were ka, no R, although the R is written. One of these forms is likely ancestral, and one is an innovation. The ancestral form is often called a residualism. So when we have multiple variants, multiple dialects that do different things, often we will assume that one of the forms is a residualism and the others are innovations. And so this can help us with reconstruction, but the trick is which is which. Which is a residualism, which is an innovation. Not straightforward, but when combined with other evidence, it can help us. Number 5, we can look at related languages. Languages, unless they're isolates, do not occur in a vacuum. That means that there are other languages related to the language in question. These can help us as well, because if they're related to the language in question, they have a common ancestor. So our reconstruction of the one language should be consistent, at least, with our reconstructions of the other languages, such that they could all presumably come from a common ancestor. So they shouldn't be reconstructed in completely incompatible ways with each other. So for example, in Old English, we want our reconstruction of Old English to be compatible with our reconstructions of Old Norse and Old High German, the related languages. And then we use these reconstructions of the older languages to reconstruct their common ancestor, Proto-Germanic, which is very fun, and I'll have to talk about that another time. Number 6, we can look at borrowings. When languages borrow words from each other, they often try to represent that word as close to what they think it sounds like as possible, while simultaneously adapting it to fit their own sound system. So when a word is borrowed, we get a unique opportunity to take a look at the sound system of the source language and the target language at the same time. In particular, Old English borrowed words from Latin at a variety of different periods, so we have lots of opportunities to use borrowings to help our reconstruction. Of course, analyzing borrowings also requires you to reconstruct the source language as well. So not straightforward either. But again, with other sources of evidence, it can help. Number 7, we have general linguistics. After studying the living languages of the world, linguists have an increasingly clear idea of what is typical for languages to do and have come up with general theories of how languages work. So proceeding from the assumption that historical people had very similar minds and bodies to our own, at least with respect to the parts of the mind and body that are involved in speech, we can assume that historical languages, as we reconstruct them, should look like plausible living languages. If not, there could be something wrong with our reconstruction. So this is a principle that's used to constrain reconstructions, so that hypotheses about past languages don't look entirely inconsistent with our theories of how present languages work. So as you can see, every one of these sources of evidence has issues, caveats, difficulties, or lack of availability in some cases. But when multiple sources of evidence converge, we become confident in our hypothesis or our reconstruction. Now, with that out of the way, let's move on to the reconstruction itself. Throughout the rest of this video, I'll be relating the Old English sound system to its spelling. And Old English spelling was never standardized. Even the same scribe will write a given word two different ways on the same page of a manuscript. But we can come up with a sort of idealized form of spelling. This is what most textbooks in Old English do. This is what Oswald Berra does. It uses a kind of an idealized spelling where every word is always spelled the same way, which is definitely not a practice that people did in the Middle Ages, but it helps us as modern learners. This is also what most dictionaries of Old English do. They standardize the spelling, and they standardize often on what is called the Early West Saxon dialect, which is the dialect used by King Alfred and the texts produced under his reign, which would be the late 9th century. Once you have become very familiar with this idealized, normalized version of Old English, then it's a lot easier to move into the a little bit more chaotic world of actual texts. But I always say, learn the norm first, then you can handle the deviations rather than trying to handle it all at once. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the vowels. Old English has 7 different vowel qualities. That is, 7 different configurations of the mouth are used to produce the vowels. And the vowels occur in 2 different quantities. That is, long and short. Long and short simply refers to how long the vowel is held for. A short vowel is held for shorter time than a long vowel, perhaps unsurprisingly. It's important to realize that these are totally different sounds from the perspective of the language. In fact, whether a word is said with a short vowel or a long vowel can completely change the meaning of the word. For example, God is God with a short O, and God with a long O is good. So important to keep the long and short vowels separate. Here is what each vowel sounds like. I'll give an example word with the vowel, and I'll also put the International Phonetic Alphabet symbol for the vowel up on the screen. If you know that, it's there for you. If you don't know that, don't worry about it. Just go off of the sound. First, the letter A. Ah. Ah. Cot. Cot. Then long A. Ah. Ah. Hall. 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 AE written together. This is the AE ligature, also called ash. Ah. Ah. Staff. Staff. Long AE, long ash. Ah. Ah. Some people also reconstruct this as eh. Eh. But I'll stick with the first one. Dal. Dal. The letter E. Eh. Eh. Bend. Bend. The long E is eh. Eh. Teeth. Teeth. There's some debate over whether the short vowels were different from their corresponding long vowels in quality in addition to quantity. Something like this is true in modern English. We have hit with eh, and heat with e. Heat is longer, but it's also different in its quality. E. So there's debate as to whether this occurred in Old English. I think the mainstream opinion is that it didn't, so that the long and short vowels were different only in length. although some people will reconstruct a little difference, like short long e. Up to you what you do. I'm gonna give you what I think is the mainstream reconstruction. I, richt, richt. Long I, mean, mean. O, holt, holt. Long O, bulk, bulk. Short U, sum, sum. Long U, horse, horse. Short Y, kyn, kyn. This may be a tough vowel for native English speakers, modern English speakers that is, to pronounce. Essentially what you do is you take the E vowel, E, and you round your lips. Ü, Ü. This is a vowel that's present in French and German as well. In French it's written with a U, and in German it's written with a U with little two dots over, which is called umlaut. Long Y, Ü, mys, mys. That is all of the simple vowels. Old English also has 3 diphthongs. A diphthong is a combination of 2 vowels where there's a smooth gliding from one vowel quality to another, but the 2 are considered part of the same syllable. So think of the modern English word high, H-I-G-H. High, it starts with the vowel here starts with an A and goes up to an E. I, high, but it's not 2 separate syllables, it's just high, 1 syllable. So that's a diphthong. In Old English, the diphthongs come in long and short pairs just as the vowels do. This is considered weird by many linguists, but we won't have to get into the details of that here. Suffice it to say, though, that this is one of the more debated aspects of Old English pronunciation. I'm going to give you something that is, I think, serviceable and fairly mainstream, but don't be surprised if you see other reconstructions of this aspect of Old English pronunciation. So what is the difference between a long and a short diphthong? Essentially, diphthongs, as you're familiar with them from modern English, are all basically the long kind. I. So just as the long vowels are held for a certain amount of time, long diphthongs are also held for an equivalent amount of time. So hus, hal, mys, high, high. That last one was the modern English, H-I-G-H. So long diphthongs are just diphthongs as you're familiar with them from modern English. Short diphthongs are a little bit different. The way that I treat short diphthongs is just as simple vowels with a very, very slight off glide. That's something like a schwa, an So you'll hear it as we go. The notation I use in IPA for these schwa off glides, it's a little non-standard, but I think you'll see what I mean as we go. The first Old English diphthong is written EA. And the short diphthong is a. For example, arn, arn. So you can see this is basically the sound a written ae, but with a little off glide. Arn. The long ea diphthong is a. So going from the a vowel to the a vowel. So the vowel spelled ae to the vowel spelled a. Ow. So for example, baum, baum. Note that the first vowel in these ea diphthongs is a, not e. So be careful. This is a bit counterintuitive, but that's the way it seems to have been. Next we have the eo diphthong, e, bern, bern. And the long eo, eo, beo, beo. The next diphthong, spelled IE, is one of the most mysterious sounds in Old English. It's often actually reconstructed as a monophthong, that is a simple vowel, so not even a diphthong at all. But you'll see a lot of different reconstructions of this. What I do is I treat it as equivalent to the letter spelled I, so it just makes an E sound. E. E. Fird. Fird. And long IE. E. E. He. He. All right, so that's all that we have for vowels. Let's talk a little bit about stress for a second because stress and vowels often interact. Stress in Old English is on the first syllable of the word with two major exceptions. But let's look at the normal case first, where stress is on the initial syllable. Mete. Mete. Leorneras. Leorneras. Kynelikor. Kynelikor. Chasterbuendum. Chasterbuendum. The first exception to this rule is the very common prefix ye, spelled G-E with a dot over the G. More on that later. This syllable is always unstressed, which means that the stress will always go on the syllable after the ye. So, for example, yemot, yemot, yemate, yemate, yewunelich, yewunelich, yeblissiende, yeblissiende. The second exception is for other prefixes. So these are things like on, for, ond, be. There are not too many of them. You'll learn to recognize them all pretty soon. And these are treated like ye and not stressed in verbs. But in other types of words, they typically are stressed. So let's look at verbs. Onginnon, onginnon. Forbernon, forbernon. Behaton, behaton. So stressed in verbs, but typically not stressed in other types of words. And in very few cases, you will see the prefixes spelled differently when they're stressed. You'll see one example in a second. So we have onion, onion, beginning, the noun. Forkuth, forkuth, wicked, an adjective. Bispel, bispel, a parable. So when the be prefix is stressed, it is b. It's pronounced b and spelled bi. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to throughout these examples is that unstressed vowels are pronounced just like their stressed counterparts. So they're not reduced to something like a schwa. So it's mete, mete, rather than meta. This change would happen later on in English and actually probably was happening towards the end of the Old English period. So it's not wrong if you see someone's reconstruction of unstressed vowels like schwa, but it's probably for a later version of Old English than we're talking about here. Now we're on to the consonants. And the consonants, there are more of them, but they're simpler for the most part. As you've probably guessed already, we've said a lot of consonants so far. Most of these consonants are pronounced more or less like their modern English counterparts. Of course, as always, the devil is in the details. Go check out Simon Roper's 2-hour video on Old English reconstruction, which is magisterial, if you want the details. But here, this is supposed to be a bit of a simpler video, so let's just go over the broad strokes, shall we? I'll be focusing only on the sounds whose pronunciation is substantially different from modern English. Let's begin with the class of letters, which differ in their pronunciations depending on where in the word they're found. These letters are pronounced one way between vowels, so in between vowels with vowels on either side. And for the purposes of this, we can count R and L as vowels as well. They're pronounced one way in that context and another way in every other context. So I'll give you an idea of what I mean. So let's look at F. The sound spelled F will be different between vowels versus everywhere else. Between vowels, we have a sound like V, like modern English V. So selvon, selvon. But the sound is pronounced like modern English F everywhere else. So feron, feron. Weave, weave. The same is true of the sound spelled like a combination of a B and a P in lowercase. This is called thorn, and it is pronounced the in between vowels, like in the modern English word the definite article. So an example would be oder, which means second. And it's pronounced th, as in the modern English word thin, as in not thick, but thin, everywhere else. So we have thrida, and bath. You'll also see this other character, which is called in modern times ev. It looks sort of like a D that's kind of leaning over and has a cross over the top. You can see it on the screen. I personally in Oswald Bera don't use this, and a lot of dictionaries don't use it, but scribes love it. There's no difference in the sound between the thorn, which is the BP combo, and the ev. There's absolutely no difference. It's just depending on how you want to write it. Let's move on to the S letter, and the S letter spells a sound Z, as in the modern English Z, between vowels. So isern, iron. Whereas everywhere else it's like the modern English S. Sa, moose. Okay, so those are the letters that sound differently in between vowels and everywhere else. Then we also have two letters which occur with and without a dot on top, and these are C and G. When C has no dot, it's pronounced like a modern English K. Künning. K. Künning. However, when a C has a dot, it's pronounced like modern English CH. Ch. Cheuzon. G is a little bit more complex, probably the most complex letter to pronounce. Let's take a look. So G is pronounced G at the start of a word. Gold. That is good. After an N, it's pronounced the same way. So singon. And remember to say that G sound. It's not sing like modern English with no G, but singon. And elsewhere, the dotless G is pronounced R. Bora. This is the GH sound of ugh, if that's something that you say. I don't know. Then we have the dotted G, and the dotted G actually has two pronunciations as well. One after N, which is J, like modern English J, J. So angel. And elsewhere, it's pronounced like modern English Y. So jar. Die. And this can actually really help you when you're looking at Old English to replace the dotted G's with Y's in most cases. And you can sometimes recognize words more easily than you otherwise would. Then we have H. H is pronounced in one of two different ways. At the start of a word, it's like the modern English H. Howl. Howl. And this is even true in places where it's awkward in modern English to do this, like ring. Everywhere else that it appears, H is going to pronounce like This is the same sound that you hear in Scots in Loch, or in German in Bach. Achta. And finally, the letter R, spelled R, is probably a tap or a trill, like R or R. So, R. Riche. Okay, now we're finished with all the single sounds. We are almost at the end. There are a few combinations you should be aware of. Number one is the combination AN, that is short A followed by N or M actually. This is going to sound a little bit different. It's going to be just like a normal ah sound, but rounded. Aw, on, lond. So almost sounds a little bit like an O, and in fact it's often spelled that way in Old English. Then we have two consonant combinations to consider. One is S and then dotted C. This is pronounced like modern English SH. Sheep. And finally, we have dotted C, dotted G, which is pronounced like modern English, like a modern English J sound if you hold it a bit longer. So it's hard to actually hear without the vowels on the other side. So as if it were adja, adja. I put A's on either side so you could hear it. So an example of this would be edge, edge. And that, my friends, is just enough Old English pronunciation to be dangerous. There are small details that we could talk about another time, but that is going to get you 95% of the way there so that you can get the most out of your Old English reading. All right, well, that is all from me. Again, if you want to go pick up Oswald Bera, the link is in the description. And until next time, happy language learning. Ka, ka, could be ka as well. Ka, ka, ka.